You're walking through a crowded subway station during rush hour, and something catches your eye that your brain struggles to process at first because it's simultaneously completely normal and fundamentally wrong. Everyone around you has a tail, not the vestigial remnant that occasionally appears in human births as a medical curiosity, but a real functional tail, as natural and essential as an arm or a leg, swaying behind each person as they move through the crowd. The tails are everywhere, draped over shoulders on the escalator to keep them from getting caught, wrapped around poles for extra stability on the moving train, gesturing expressively during conversations in ways that add an entire dimension to human body language you've never seen before. A mother keeps her restless child close by gently holding his tail while they wait on the platform. A businessman unconsciously curls his tail around his briefcase handle, a security measure as automatic as gripping with your hand. Two friends, greeting each other, intertwine their tails briefly in a gesture that clearly means something intimate and friendly, a form of connection that has no equivalent in your tailless reality. This is Earth, but not the Earth you know. A planet where human evolution took a different path 25 million years ago, when our primate ancestors were deciding which body plan would carry them into the future. In our timeline, we lost our tails and gained something else. In this timeline, we kept them, and that single anatomical difference has cascaded through millions of years of evolution, changing not just our bodies, but our brains, our societies, our technologies, and our understanding of what it means to be human. Let's walk through this parallel Earth and discover what we became when we chose to remain creatures of the branch and the canopy, even as we descended to the ground and built civilizations that reached toward the stars. To understand what we've lost and what this alternate humanity has kept, we need to appreciate what a tail actually is and why our real ancestors gave theirs up. Around 25 million years ago, the common ancestor of all apes, including humans, underwent a genetic mutation that effectively shut down tail development in embryos. The genes responsible for building a tail are still in our DNA. Every human carries them, but they've been switched off by regulatory changes that prevent them from being expressed. This wasn't a random accident. Evolution doesn't eliminate complex functional structures unless there's a good reason. And for early apes, the reason was probably related to a shift in locomotion style. Apes were developing a more upright posture, moving through trees by hanging beneath branches and swinging rather than running along the tops of branches like monkeys do. In this new style of movement, a tail became more liability than asset. It added weight without providing much benefit, and the muscles and neural infrastructure needed to control a tail were expensive from an energy perspective, requiring brain tissue and metabolic resources that could be better used elsewhere. So, natural selection favored individuals with shorter tails, and over millions of years, the tail vanished entirely from the ape lineage, leaving only the coccyx, a small cluster of fused vertebrae at the base of our spine that serves as an evolutionary memorial to what we once had. But imagine that mutation never happened, or happened differently, that our ape ancestors retained their tails even as they developed upright posture and increased intelligence. The tail would need to evolve alongside the rest of the body to remain useful, becoming stronger and more dexterous to serve new functions as we transitioned from arboreal life to terrestrial existence and eventually to tool use and language and civilization. The tailed humans of this alternate Earth would still walk upright, Bipedalism offers too many advantages to give up once you've evolved it, but their posture and skeletal structure would be significantly different from ours. The pelvis would need to be modified to accommodate the powerful muscles that control a functional tail, making it wider and altering the angle of the spine. This would change the way tailed humans walk. They would have a slightly different gait, perhaps a bit more sway in the hips, the tail moving as a counterbalance with each step, helping to distribute weight and maintain equilibrium in ways our tailless bodies have to manage through subtle adjustments of our arms and torso. The tail itself would be a marvel of biological engineering, probably around 3 to 4 feet long in adults, composed of dozens of small vertebrae that allow it to curve and flex in almost any direction, wrapped in powerful muscles that give it strength comparable to an arm, though with different capabilities. Where our arms excel at reaching and manipulating objects in front of us, the tail would excel at tasks behind and below, creating a sphere of interaction around the body rather than just a forward-facing field. The tip of the tail might have evolved to be particularly sensitive and dexterous, perhaps developing a slightly flattened prehensile end similar to the tails of some New World monkeys, allowing for fine motor control that could grip branches or tools or other objects. The skin covering the tail would be tougher than the skin on our backs, but more sensitive than the skin on our feet, packed with nerve endings that provide detailed sensory information about whatever the tail is touching, making it genuinely useful for exploring environments and manipulating objects, not just decorative. The brain would need significant modification to accommodate tail control, because controlling a tail requires dedicating substantial neural real estate to processing sensory input from it and coordinating the complex muscle movements it's capable of. In our brains, the primary motor cortex and somatosensory cortex are organized into a map of the body called the homunculus, where different regions correspond to different body parts, with the size of each region proportional to how much fine motor control or sensory input that body part requires. Hands and face are huge in the homunculus because they're incredibly sensitive and precisely controlled. In tailed humans, the tail would occupy a substantial portion of these maps, possibly as large as a leg, requiring the brain to be either larger overall to accommodate the additional neural tissue or reorganized to make room by reducing space dedicated to other functions. Given that human brains are already pushing the limits of what the body can support metabolically and what can physically fit through the birth canal, tailed humans would probably evolve differently structured brains, perhaps with the tail control regions organized more efficiently, or with cognitive functions distributed differently to create space for the motor and sensory processing the tail demands. Childhood development would be dramatically different, because children would need to learn to control their tails with the same dedication they currently apply to learning to use their hands. Infant-tailed humans would be born with tails that move reflexively, curling and uncurling in response to stimuli without conscious control, much like how newborn human babies make random arm and leg movements before learning coordinated reaching and walking. Over the first few years of life, children would gradually develop conscious control over their tails, learning to use them for balance while learning to walk. Then, as manipulative organs as their fine motor skills develop. Playgrounds would be designed completely differently, with structures that children can grip with their tails, games that involve tail dexterity and strength, social interactions where tail touching and wrapping establish hierarchies and friendships. By adolescence, tail control would be as automatic and precise as hand control is for us, an effortless extension of the will that requires no conscious thought in routine tasks, but can be focused into fine manipulation when needed. The mechanics of sitting would be one of the most obvious differences between our world and theirs, because sitting on a tail is uncomfortable and potentially damaging, which means all furniture would need to be designed with tail accommodation in mind. Chairs would have open backs or built-in grooves where tails can rest comfortably, or they would be backless stools where the tail hangs freely behind the sitter. Benches in public spaces would have regular gaps to allow tails to drape through. Car seats, airplane seats, office chairs, all would include tail considerations in their design, perhaps adjustable sections that can be positioned based on individual tail length and preference. Sleeping would also be different. Beds might be wider to accommodate the tail without it hanging off the edge or getting tangled in blankets, and sleeping positions would favor sides and stomachs over backs, since lying on one's back with a tail requires either uncomfortable bunching or a specially designed mattress with a channel for the tail to rest in. These might seem like trivial details, but they would affect every single moment of daily life. Constant small accommodations that tailless humans never need to consider. Clothing would evolve entirely differently because pants and skirts, as we know them, are designed for tailless bodies and would be completely impractical for tailed humans. The most likely solution is that clothing would split into upper body and lower body garments with a significant gap between them. Shirts or tunics covering the torso and arms, and separate leg coverings similar to chaps or loose leg wraps, with the tail remaining naked or perhaps decorated with jewelry, paint, or temporary wrappings depending on cultural norms and fashion trends. In cold climates, the tail might be wrapped in insulating materials similar to scarves, but most of the time it would be left uncovered because covering the tail reduces its utility and sensory input. Fashion would develop around tail ornamentation rather than tail covering. Different cultures creating elaborate tail jewelry, tattoos that spiral down the length of the tail, or dyeing techniques that color the tail fur or skin in patterns that signify status, affiliation, or personal aesthetic. The tail would become one of the primary sites of personal expression, as important as hairstyle and clothing choice are in our world. Sports would be unrecognizably different, because any physical activity that doesn't incorporate the tail would be ignoring 30% of the body's manipulative and balance-maintaining capability, making it artificial and constrained. Gymnastics would be absolutely spectacular. Athletes performing moves that use all four limbs plus the tail simultaneously, creating aerial maneuvers and floor routines of stunning complexity that our gymnastics can't approach. Swimming would be transformed by the tail's powerful undulation. Tailed humans potentially developing techniques where the tail provides primary propulsion, like a dolphin's fluke, making them significantly faster in water than tailless humans. Team sports would incorporate tail-based passing and catching. Basketball players using their tails to secure the ball while using hands for other purposes. Soccer players potentially using tails to control or even kick the ball in situations where feet are occupied. Combat sports would include tail grappling as a fundamental technique. Fighters wrapping their tails around opponents' limbs or bodies to restrict movement or set up throws and submissions. Every sport we know would need to be reimagined to account for the tail, and entirely new sports would emerge that have no equivalent in our tailless reality. Communication would be enriched by an entire dimension of body language that we lack, because tails are incredibly expressive and would inevitably become part of the signaling system that humans use to convey emotion and intention. The position and movement of the tail would communicate constantly. A raised tail might indicate confidence or aggression. A lowered tail, submission or sadness. A rapidly flicking tail, irritation or impatience. A gently swaying tail, contentment or relaxation. These signals would be as automatic and unconscious as facial expressions are for us, impossible to suppress completely even when trying to hide emotions, which means tailed humans would actually be more transparent emotionally than we are. Their internal states constantly betrayed by their tails, even when their faces and voices are controlled. This would make lying and deception more difficult, requiring conscious effort to control not just facial expression and tone, but also tail position and movement. And people would become skilled at reading tails the way we read faces, detecting subtle inconsistencies that reveal dishonesty or hidden emotions. Cultural norms around tail expression would develop, contexts where tail control is expected and failure to control your tail is considered rude or inappropriate, similar to how we expect people to maintain certain facial expressions in formal situations even if they're feeling different emotions internally. Romance and intimacy would involve the tail in ways that would seem alien to us, because any body part with such extensive sensory innervation and motor control inevitably becomes involved in touch-based bonding. Tail touching between romantic partners would probably carry significance similar to holding hands or kissing, a form of physical connection that indicates trust and affection. Tail intertwining during intimate moments would be standard, the tails wrapping around each other in patterns that feel pleasurable due to the sensory feedback, creating bonding experiences that have no direct equivalent in tailless human sexuality. Cultural taboos would develop around inappropriate tail touching. Grabbing someone's tail without permission would be considered as violating as inappropriate touching of other private body parts, and accidental tail contact in crowded spaces would be an endless source of social awkwardness, requiring elaborate conventions of apology and reassurance. Children would be taught tail etiquette from an early age, learning what kinds of tail contact are acceptable in different social contexts, developing the same internalized rules about tail space that we have about personal space. Architecture and urban design would be fundamentally altered by the presence of tails, because human bodies would have different space requirements and different capabilities. Doorways might be wider to accommodate tails without people needing to angle themselves or hold their tails awkwardly while passing through. Public transportation would have different space allocation, perhaps more standing room with better grab handles positioned for tail gripping, making it possible to stand stably in a moving vehicle without using hands at all. Buildings designed for tailed humans might incorporate more vertical elements, railings, and bars at various heights that can be gripped by hands or tails, making it easier to navigate spaces with multiple levels. Playgrounds and parks would include structures that appeal to the semi-arboreal nature that tails imply, more climbing structures, more things to hang from and swing on, designs that let people use their bodies the way tailed humans naturally want to use them, even in urban environments. the aesthetic of architecture might trend toward more organic flowing forms rather than the rigid rectangles that dominate our cities, because tailed humans would have a different sense of natural movement and might prefer spaces that accommodate curves and three-dimensional navigation. The history of technology development would follow different paths because tools would be designed for beings with an extra grasping appendage. Early humans in our world developed stone tools that required precise hand grip and manipulation, driving the co-evolution of hands and brains in a feedback loop where better hands allowed more sophisticated tools, which selected for smarter brains, which invented even better tools. Tailed humans would have that same feedback loop, but with the added dimension of the tail, potentially allowing the development of tools that require 3 points of manipulation simultaneously. One person holding a worked stone with their tail while using both hands to strike it from different angles. Or later technologies like weaving or metalworking that benefit from having a third manipulator to hold tension or position materials. This might have accelerated technological development in some areas, making complex manufacturing techniques possible earlier in history, because the manipulation challenges that limited tailless humans wouldn't have been as restrictive. Alternatively, it might have slowed development in other areas, because having the tail as a solution for many manipulation problems might have reduced the pressure to invent mechanical alternatives. Tailed humans might not have invented certain labor-saving devices as early because they could accomplish manually what we needed machines for. Warfare would be more brutal and close quarters, because the tail provides significant advantage in grappling and wrestling combat. A soldier who can wrap their tail around an opponent's leg while using both hands to wield weapons or control their opponent's arms has a substantial edge in hand-to-hand fighting. Military training would necessarily include extensive tail combat techniques, and armor design would need to protect the tail without restricting its movement too much, probably resulting in articulated tail guards made of overlapping plates or chainmail that allow flexibility while providing some protection against cuts. Ranged weapons would still dominate warfare once they were invented, but the transition from melee to ranged combat might have happened differently, because tailed humans would have more effective close combat capabilities, potentially making formations like phalanxes or shield walls more effective for longer periods, delaying the point where ranged weapons made traditional heavy infantry obsolete. Modern military tactics would incorporate the tail's capabilities, soldiers using tails to anchor themselves while furring from unstable positions, or to carry extra equipment, or to provide enhanced mobility in difficult terrain. Medicine would need to account for an entire additional anatomical system. Tail injuries would be common and potentially debilitating, given how important the tail is for balance and manipulation. Broken tail vertebrae would be treated with the same seriousness as broken legs, requiring immobilization and long recovery periods. Tail amputations due to accidents or medical necessity would be emotionally traumatic in ways that might exceed even the loss of a limb, because the tail is involved in so much of social communication and intimate interaction. Losing it would mean losing an essential part of how you relate to other humans. Phantom tail syndrome would affect amputees, their brains still allocating neural resources to processing input from a tail that's no longer there, creating sensations of movement and touch from the missing appendage. Medical technology might develop prosthetic tails, mechanical replacements that can be controlled through neural interfaces, though they would never perfectly replicate the sensory richness and control precision of a biological tail. Public health initiatives would focus on tail safety, campaigns to prevent tail injuries in workplaces and schools, ergonomic guidelines for proper tail posture to avoid chronic pain. The question of whether tailed humans would have evolved higher intelligence than tailless humans is genuinely uncertain, because brain size is constrained by multiple factors, and adding tail control to the brain's responsibilities might have forced trade-offs that reduced cognitive capacity in other areas. On one hand, tool use with 3 manipulators instead of 2 might have driven more sophisticated spatial reasoning and planning abilities, selecting for larger or more efficiently organized brains that could coordinate complex multi-part manipulations. On the other hand, the metabolic cost of maintaining a large brain plus the neural tissue to control a dexterous tail might have been too high, forcing an evolutionary compromise where brains stayed smaller or tail control stayed simpler. The most likely outcome is that tailed humans would have roughly similar average intelligence to tailless humans, but with cognitive profiles that differ in specific domains, possibly superior spatial manipulation abilities and body awareness, possibly inferior in areas like abstract symbolic reasoning, if the brain space normally dedicated to that was partially repurposed for tail control. They wouldn't be smarter or dumber overall, just differently smart, their intelligence shaped by different evolutionary pressures. Art and performance would incorporate the tail as a primary medium, dance styles developing that treat the tail as essential to expression rather than as an afterthought or limitation. Imagine ballet, where dancers use their tails for balance and for creating shapes impossible with just arms and legs. Or contemporary dance, where tail movements convey emotion and narrative with the same importance as facial expression and gesture. Martial arts would have forms that flow seamlessly between hand, foot, and tail techniques, creating combat styles that look utterly alien to our eyes, but are deeply elegant within their own logic. Visual artists might use their tails to paint or sculpt, holding brushes or tools with their tails while their hands position the canvas or material, allowing for creative processes that incorporate more simultaneous control than our artists can manage. Musical instruments would be designed to be playable with tail manipulation. Perhaps percussion instruments, where the tail strikes surfaces in patterns coordinated with hand movements, or string instruments, where the tail controls pitch or resonance while hands handle bowing or plucking. Space exploration would face unique challenges because microgravity environments make tails incredibly useful for maneuvering and anchoring, but also create problems with equipment design and safety. A tail in zero gravity would be in constant motion unless deliberately controlled, potentially bumping into equipment or tangling in cables, which means spacecraft and space station design would need to account for tails in ways our actual space technology doesn't. On the other hand, astronauts with tails would have better natural control in zero-gravity environments, using their tails to grip handholds or to position their bodies for work without needing to use their hands, making them potentially more effective in spacewalks or in tight spaces where hands are needed for tool manipulation. Space suits would need to be designed with tail accommodation, probably an articulated section that keeps the tail pressurized and protected while allowing enough flexibility for it to remain useful. The tail might actually provide advantages in space that outweigh the engineering complications, making tailed humans better suited for long-term space habitation than our tailless version turned out to be. Cultural attitudes toward the tail would vary enormously across different societies, some viewing it as sacred or spiritually significant, others treating it as purely functional, with no special meaning beyond its physical utility. Some cultures might develop elaborate tail binding traditions similar to foot binding in historical China, deliberately restricting tail development or movement in pursuit of aesthetic ideals, or to signify high status, implying the person doesn't need to use their tail for manual labor. Other cultures might celebrate tail strength and dexterity, holding competitions to display tail prowess the way we have arm wrestling or weightlifting competitions. Religious practices might incorporate tail gestures into prayer or meditation, specific tail positions holding symbolic meaning in different faith traditions. The diversity of tail-related cultural practices would be as vast as the diversity of cultural practices around any other important body part, reflecting the endless human capacity for taking biological facts and building complex symbolic and social meanings around them. The psychological experience of being tailed would be profoundly different from our embodied experience, because we are our bodies, and our bodies shape how we think and feel and relate to the world. Tailed humans would have a different sense of self-boundary, their body image, including the tail, as naturally as ours, includes arms and legs, and the constant sensory input from the tail would color their moment-to-moment experience of being in the world. They would probably have a more acute sense of the space behind them, because the tail provides sensory information about that region that we only get visually by turning around. Their emotional experience might be slightly more transparent to themselves as well as others, because the tail's unconscious expressiveness would provide feedback about their own internal states, a visible external indicator of emotions that are still forming. The relationship between mind and body would be different in subtle ways that are hard for us to imagine, because we can only understand embodiment through the bodies we have. And a tailed body is different enough that the subjective experience of inhabiting one would be qualitatively distinct from anything tailless humans can directly know. And yet, despite all these differences, tailed humans would still recognizably be humans, still possessed of the same core drives and capacities that define our species, still capable of love and creativity and cruelty and cooperation, still building societies and technologies and meanings in a universe that doesn't care about them. They would look in mirrors and see something we would find strange, a body plan that our evolution rejected, but that theirs retained, and they would think thoughts shaped by that body, but not determined by it, because human consciousness is more than just the meat that generates it. If we could somehow meet these tailed cousins, separated from us by a divergence 25 million years in the past, we would find them both familiar and alien, sharing language and laughter, and the fundamental experience of being self-aware, beings trying to make sense of existence, but expressing that consciousness through bodies that move differently, gesture differently, touch differently. And in that meeting, we might learn something about which aspects of humanity are truly essential and which are contingent on the particular evolutionary path we happen to take, about whether losing our tails was a sacrifice that bought us something valuable or just an accident that happened to work out, about what it means to be human when the human form itself could have been different. So we return to that subway station where this journey began, watching tailed humans move through their morning commute with their tails swaying and gripping and gesturing in a constant subtle dance of balance and communication. The scene is ordinary to them, mundane and unremarkable, but to us, it represents a road not taken, a version of humanity that could have been if one small genetic change had happened differently, or not at all, millions of years before anything we would recognize as human existed. Our ancestors chose to walk upright with no tail, to commit fully to a body plan optimized for long-distance walking and endurance running, to free up cognitive resources by eliminating the tail and invest them elsewhere. And that choice cascaded through evolutionary time to produce us, tailless apes who built civilization using just our hands and our brains. Their ancestors made a different choice, or more accurately, evolution made it for them, keeping the tail and adapting it for new purposes as they walked upright and developed intelligence and language and culture. Neither choice was right or wrong. Neither was better or worse. They were just different paths that led to different destinations, both arriving at beings capable of asking why they are the way they are and imagining how they might have been different. The tail we lost is still in us, encoded in genes that will never express, a ghost of possibilities that evolution closed off when it committed to the tailless human form. But in this parallel Earth, those possibilities remained open, and the result is a humanity we can imagine but never fully understand, familiar enough to recognize, but different enough to remind us that what we are is not what we had to be, just what we happen to become.